Hi everyone, it's Will Venus. Welcome back to my channel and to part 2 of the Hilda Ogden story. If you missed part 1, I will link it up here. Okay, so in the previous episode we stopped at around 1973, and so we'll just proceed from there. So in 1973, the Ogdens, Stan and Hilda, were about to celebrate their pearl wedding anniversary at number 13 by holding a little party. And somehow someone got onto the subject of Hilda's son Trevor, and he was a bit of an estranged person. He wasn't really an ever-present feature in Stan and Hilda's life, and we'll get on to why that was later on in this episode. But this really struck a nerve with Hilda. She did actually really regret not having a good relationship with both her children, actually, but more so with Trevor. And so the Ogdens, they wanted to track Trevor down because they weren't exactly sure where he was situated. They didn't know where he was. And when they did find where their son was, it was at a more posher dwelling than their own, shall we say. Trevor was actually found to be living in Chesterfield, which was a far cry from the Edwardian terrace houses of his upbringing. Trevor had risen through the ranks, and he went from working in the woodyard to being a fully fledged estate agent. So he was doing really well for himself. Yeah, because it's not something that you would have thought of one of the Ogdens doing a job that would involve wearing a suit. So when they did eventually meet, there was many revelations that came out that day. Now, unbeknown to Stan and Hilda, Trevor had actually got married to a woman called Polly, and they'd had a son called Damien, the devil child. Now, Trevor had actually lied to his wife by saying that his parents had both died because he was actually quite ashamed of them. He said that he was quite ashamed of them in the sense that they were quite working class and they didn't really come from money. And he said to his wife that if they did eventually meet again, that all they would do was just sponge off him, which is a really awful thing to say because they wouldn't have done that. Also, just a quick note, no matter who you are or where you come from or what your past is, always be proud of yourself. Never be ashamed of anything. Unless you're, a really despicable person, that's all you should be ashamed of. But nothing to do with class or how much money you have or where you live. That doesn't impact you if you're a good person. Sorry, I've got something in my eye there. Apologies. Now, for Trevor to say that he was quite ashamed of his parents is actually quite ironic, because in 1964, when he left, because he was only there for a short time when Stan and Hilda moved into number 13, when an unexploded bomb was found in Albert Tatlock's backyard, the whole street had to be evacuated. Now, when this was happening, what Trevor did was he broke into the corner shop and stole cigarettes and money. And he couldn't actually face the music for that, so what he did was leave Stan and Hilda a note to say that he'd left for London rather than take the rap for that. So it's kind of ironic, really, that he was ashamed of his parents being working class, him being an actual thief. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. Yeah, so Trevor was no angel, let's put it that way. Now, this wasn't actually the first time that he would take advantage of a bad situation, but we'll come to that later on in this episode, so keep watching. Yeah, so Trevor stealing from the shop, it really left a bad taste in his dad's mouth. Stan was actually quite ashamed that Trevor did that, and that's kind of the reason that Stan was always quite reluctant to go to find where Trevor was, because he didn't really want to know him after doing that to both the business that was next door to him and his friend, who I believe at the time that owned the shop was Florrie Lindley. And I've actually done a video about her, so go check that out. It's in this playlist that I'll leave at the end of this episode. Okay, so we get to 1976, and this is one of Stan and Hilda's, well, arguably one of their more finer moments in the street. Now, Hilda was always pestering Stan to make improvements to the house, so rather than Stan go to like a DIY shop or, somewhere to buy wallpaper, he thought he would get his family friend Eddie Yates to go and source some wallpaper for him. But Eddie didn't actually do that. What he did was he got wallpaper from a friend. Now, this friend, he didn't really want to give the details of where this friend was or where he got it. But, yeah, the real answer was that it was likely that this wallpaper had just fallen off the back of a lorry, but he told Hilda and Stan, well, Hilda mainly, that the wallpaper came from a friend so that she would be accepting of it. But the problem was there wasn't enough wallpaper to do all 4 walls of their lounge, only enough for 3. So Hilda said, no, it's not enough. They then came back with more wallpaper. That wallpaper didn't match. He came back again. Yeah, God loves a trier. He then came back again with a boy's, children's wallpaper. Stan loved the idea of having children's wallpaper in his lounge, but Hilda said, no, we're not children. We want proper wallpaper for our lounge. And so when he came back this final time, Eddie brought something back that would literally change Hilda's life for the better, because she got something that no one else in the street had, and something that she felt would be the envy of the street. What he brought her back was her beloved Muriel. Now, can you remember I said in the previous episode that Hilda always mucked up her words? She didn't call it a mural, she called it her Muriel. Okay, so from this moment on, she referred to this mural as her Muriel, and it was like her pride and joy. Now, the Muriel was actually a picture of the Canadian Rockies, which I didn't know until recently. I just thought it was like a random picturesque landscape, but no, it was the Canadian Rockies. And after this was applied, installed, or whatever, Hilda would often sit there and, look at this Muriel, in complete wonderment and just imagine herself being at that actual scene at the Canadian Rockies. And yeah, it was a great source of comfort and joy to her. And so, of course, the time came to show off this blessed Muriel, and first she invited along Bet Lynch. Bet was quite taken aback by this Muriel. I think I'll just call it Muriel because that's what Hilda called it, so yeah, we must respect the character. And then it came to Annie Walker's turn to come and see this Muriel, and Annie Walker, she took one look at it and she said, "Oh dear, Mrs Ogden, would you mind if I took a seat a while I acclimatise?" And, Annie Walker's usual inimitable way, and yeah, they were quite taken aback by this. I think Hilda saw something different to what the rest of the world saw when they saw this Muriel. Now, in the spring of 1997, Hilda was employed by Mike Baldwin. She was employed as a cleaner at his new place of business called Baldwin's Casuals. And so she would usually go in there after the rest of the factory girls had done their day's work, which usually involved things like cutting up material, sewing it together to make garments, and later on curtains. Hilda's job was to go in afterwards and, sweep up the trimmings, do a bit of dusting, clean the little office space and such. But she thought she would, try her hand because she could actually use a sewing machine, and so she used the sewing machine out of hours and without permission by Mike Baldwin to make things for herself. And when Stan and Eddie found out what she was doing, they said, well, you can use those machines and, make things to sell them. But of course, the Ogdens, never known for their luck, they were found out, Mike Baldwin found out, and he soon put a stop to it. And so, yeah, the rest of that year carried on as normal for the Ogdens. Now, it comes to 1978, and I've just watched an episode of this somewhere, and an old flame of Hilda's called Ralph Curtis. He was an American guy. He was doing rounds of the UK. He was visiting. So he was visiting places like Weatherfield, Newcastle, Edinburgh, and a few other places, but he thought he would pop by to see Hilda. And so when he wrote to her, of course, Hilda had to tell Stan about the letter. Stan wasn't too impressed, and he said, nope, not having her here. He just didn't like the idea at all. But when Hilda found out that he was coming, she got a new dress, did her makeup, had her hair done so that she looked really nice for him. And instead of Stan not liking him, he actually turned out to have quite a good conversation with him. So it wasn't quite the reception that Hilda was expecting. He was actually quite pleasant to this guy. I think, in all honesty, Stan probably felt a bit threatened by this guy because it was something that was completely different to himself, and he possibly thought that this Ralph guy might take Hilda away from him, but that just wasn't true. Hilda was just absolutely devoted to Stan and their marriage, so it just wouldn't happen. Now, throughout the later 70s, Hilda was involved in quite a few rows at the factory, but one in particular was when syndicate money went missing. Yeah, but that was just like a minor discrepancy and disagreement, and that was soon cleared up, and it always went back to, well, I want to say normal, but not quite normal, because it was never absolutely normal at the factory. There was always someone having a disagreement. And I think when you have people like Hilda and Vera, which are like two powerhouses, when they come together they really clash. So yeah, I think two strong women, they're bound to have their disagreements because their personalities are both so strong. And that was pretty much the 1970s for Hilda, and so we get on to the 1980s. Now, the 1980s was the last decade that Hilda was around on Coronation Street. Now, as again, it's a running feature, in the 1980s to be more specific, Hilda was really short of money, and so what she did was she rented her front parlour out to Eddie Yates. And also with Stan not being famous for his track record in keeping employment, that's kind of why she had to do that. Eddie could actually afford the rent that she was charging because he'd managed to find full-time employment on the refuse collection with the local council. This was after one of his last stints in prison. So yeah, it was good they had that opportunity of employment, because let's not forget, not everyone, especially late 70s, early 80s, if you have a like a prison record, criminal convictions and things, employment isn't always the easiest of options, is it? Not that I'm saying it's been completely eradicated now, there is still stigma. But yeah, it was lucky that he got that job. Now, like I said, he was working on the bins, and so what he would do, as he was doing his, the rounds of the streets and things, if there was anything that's one of the people put out in the street for collection, if he thought that that was of value or, of use to Hilda, he would bring things home. Later on in time, one of these things turned out to be a little plastic visor that he put across the television, because by that point, Stan and Hilda still had a black and white television, and this screen thing that he brought back for them, this was apparently meant to turn your black and white television into colour television, but it just gave a slight tinge to the picture. And Hilda said, no, that's not good. She just said it like it was. It was not good. It was just a sheet of plastic for putting across the television, and it made very little difference. Hilda still wanted her brand new telly. Also, just quick to note, during the later 1970s, early 80s, actor Bernard Ewins that played Stan, he had been plagued by ill health. In 1975, he had a stroke, and so what they had to do on Coronation Street was reflect this in the storylines, and by bringing in Eddie, that kind of took the onus off of Bernard Ewins. And so the way it worked is Eddie would have more dialogue to say, and Bernard Ewins would have less to learn, and so he could still be present within scenes but not have so much dialogue to learn and say. And so you'll notice, well, if you look back at the later episodes of Stan being in it, compared with his earlier scenes, Stan was a lot slower. His as in his physical movement, his speech was a lot more slurred, and sometimes his words wouldn't quite get out. You'll have to watch it to see what I mean, but yeah, you could definitely see a decline from Stan's early days to his later days. Yeah, so Bernard, he wasn't quite able to articulate his dialogue and his speech in the manner that he was used to doing. He had been doing regular sessions of speech therapy, which restored a lot of his speech, but not to its full former potential. And as Hilda had been working very hard, keeping a roof over their head and food in their bellies and things and paying the bills, she decided that she would treat herself to her very own cleaner, and so she did for a few sessions, but after a few sessions she couldn't really afford it and had to let that lady go. So yeah, the Ogdens' luck not always running as smoothly as I suppose the viewers would have liked it to. We come to, like I said, the early 80s, and Stan and Hilda had won a competition. What they had won was a second honeymoon, and it was like an all expenses paid at this really posh hotel, so Hilda really looked forward to that. Stan, a little bit more apprehensive, but Hilda, she was really looking forward to it. When they got there, Hilda especially, she was really taken by the posh decorations, the quality and feel of the curtains, the comfy bed, the way the bed was all nicely laundered and, all nicely folded and made, and the glassware, and just the attentiveness of the staff, and of course the food. And they were given ample supply of alcohol, which of course Stan just guzzled. Drink was Stan's favourite thing. Now, during this stay, again, this is one of their more memorable scenes. Stan and Hilda are drinking champagne from these tiny little champagne, I don't think they're called flutes. They're the more rounded glasses. I'll pop a picture in. I can't remember what they're called, but I suppose one of you could let me know in the comments, please. And they're sipping the champagne, and they're a little bit tipsy, a little bit relaxed, and Hilda says to Stan, "Kiss me." And Stan's like, "What?" And Hilda goes, "Come on, you appetite pith." But Stan's not really wanting to do the whole kissing and physical thing, and Hilda's saying back to Stan, "Come on, you appetite pith. You wasn't always all backwards and coming forwards." And so he does lean in for a kiss, and he tastes her lipstick. And then he's like, "What's that lipstick taste of?" And this is one of my favourite lines of Corrie of all time. And Hilda goes, "Woman, Stanley. Woman." Yeah, and that's one of their most famous scenes. that line in the hotel. Hi everyone, sorry about that. I had to go and do something for an hour. No, not that. Cheeky. Yeah, I had to go and do something, so sorry if the lighting and things look a bit different, but I shall continue on from where I started when I ended the last video, so it'll be seamless to you, but here we go. Also, just to let you know, I need to speak a little bit more quieter because it's getting later on in the evening, so I have neighbours to consider, so I'll try and adjust the volume a little bit, but it'll be absolutely fine for you, so don't worry. And so, yeah, it comes to 1981, and Hilda found herself cleaning Len and Rita Fairclough's house, which was at number 9. And also, within the autumn of that year, Hilda had secured a place doing another cleaning job for Mike Baldwin in the form of his trendy flat, which was away from the street. I can't remember exactly where, but if any of you guys know, please let me know in the comments. That would be fabulous. Now, whilst working there, Hilda had never been used to anything more technical than a light switch or a vacuum cleaner switch, and so mistakenly when Hilda was cleaning for Mike in his new flat, she accidentally triggered his house alarm. And what happened was the police turned up at the door and they actually thought that she was a burglar. Yeah, little Hilda in her turban and rollers, they thought she was a burglar. But I suppose it can take all sorts, can't it? Yeah, I think they thought that she was a burglar on a recce. But they soon laughed it off when the police did find out that Hilda wasn't in fact a burglar, she was just a cleaner. And so 1982 arrived and Hilda found herself in a more prominent position cleaning for Dr. and Mrs Lowther. This was to be one of her longer lasting cleaning jobs, and she felt more like kind of she'd made it because she was cleaning for a professional and his wife. But again, as with everything to do with the Ogdens, it soon was followed with heartache again. Hilda found out that her brother Archie had passed away, and he had passed away from a heart attack. Now, I actually watched this episode recently, and when Hilda told Stan about Archie's heart attack, Stan seemed to really care for her, and when Hilda started to break down, you could really see Stan comforting her because he placed his hand over hers, and yeah, that was quite nice to witness when all you're really used to seeing on screen is Stan being really selfish, really. Yeah, so that was one of the more touching moments between Stan and Hilda. But as with a lot of deaths, soon followed what happened to Archie's estate. Now, Archie was the proud owner of a fish and chip shop. Now, by this point, Archie, he wasn't actually married, but he did have a common law wife. Now, I believe that common law just basically means that you have two people who live together, who people assume are husband and wife, but aren't actually legally married. And yeah, Archie had one of these. Now, because this common law wife lived with Archie for a little while and worked in the chip shop with him a lot, she felt that she was legally entitled to inherit this chip shop. Because you see, Archie hadn't actually left any, last will or testament. So yeah, the chippy was, as it's known in the UK, it was pretty much up for grabs. Because you see, Hilda was Archie's only remaining living relative, so legally, well actually after she took legal advice from a solicitor, the chip shop soon went into Hilda's name and she took ownership of that chip shop, which was a bit, for Stan it was a bit like being a child in a sweet shop. He could just fill his boots with anything and everything he could get his hands on to eat in this chip shop. Fish and chips was his favourite thing to eat. Yeah, so that would have been akin to winning the lottery for Stan, so it'd be like free chippies for life. Now, can you remember earlier on in this episode how I said how Trevor wasn't exactly the best son in the world? Well, when Hilda inherited this chip shop and Trevor, her son, found out about Archie passing away, the first thing that was on his mind was, what was it? That's right, money. And so he visited his mum soon after Archie passed away to see how she was and to see if she needed anything or any help. He was actually quite devious because what he did was he came over to Hilda's house at number 13 Coronation Street under the pretext of letting Hilda see her grandchild, which I think is pretty shady, don't you? That's pretty underhanded. You don't bring kids into these things. That's just plain nasty. Playing on people's feelings, no, it's not a good thing to do. And so Trevor started asking a lot of questions of, well, what's the arrangements for Archie's funeral? And he expressed concern over the cost of it, saying that it would be cheaper to have Archie cremated. But yeah, I think really all he was interested in was there any money in it for him, or if all the money was getting left to Hilda, she should be saving all that she could and not spending on silly things like a proper funeral, so that if anything happened to Hilda, Trevor could get all the money. I know, awful. But I mean, the success for that chip shop didn't really last long, because Hilda soon had to sell it because Archie had run up a lot of debts, so they had to sell the business to pay off those debts, and they weren't really left with a lot of change, really. Unfortunately, so Hilda was back to square one, really. Now, at the end of 1983 saw Eddie Yates marry his sweetheart, that was Marion Willis. Hilda felt very honoured because she was asked to, at Eddie and Marion's wedding, she was asked if she would be a stand-in for Eddie's mum. Now, Eddie actually said to Hilda, I do see you as kind of my adopted mum, which was an absolute honour for Hilda. And like I said before, Eddie was like the son that she should have had instead of Trevor. And so yeah, that was the end of 1983, and so we begin 1984. And there's some more heartache on the way, I'm afraid. Not just heartbreaking for Hilda, but also heartbreaking for the UK nation. Now, by this point, Stan was aged 64 and he was starting to draw his pension, but in the show he'd been ill for quite some time. And it was a bit like life imitating art, because in real life, actor Bernard Ewins had been suffering really, really ill health. Yeah, so at the beginning and most of 1984, actor Bernard Ewins had been in and out of hospital. His health was just really declining, and so Corrie bosses had to reflect that in the storylines. So that's kind of what happened to Stan. And so in the scripts, it was said to be bedridden, and so it was just off camera for quite a long period of time in 1984. And that just had to leave Hilda carrying on life as normal. She still had to go out to work to earn money to, look after herself and Stan, because he wasn't bringing in any money, of course, being ill in bed. Now, in the second half of 1984, Hilda was absolutely exhausted. She was looking after Stan and at the same time doing a few different jobs, just to keep the money coming in, because we've all got to put milk in our cornflakes. What happened was, one day she was actually that exhausted that she slept in for one of her cleaning gigs at the Rovers, and she was almost sacked by Billy Walker until she explained what was going on. Now, as Stan's condition at home worsened, Hilda was persuaded to let Stan go into hospital just to have some tests to, see what was going on, and if there was anything that they could do for Stan to improve his quality of life. Whereas in real life, in the summer of 1984, actor Bernard Ewins had passed away from a heart attack, and that kind of was the explanation as to why Stan wasn't seen the rest of that year, because obviously, you can't play a character if you've passed away. So the Corrie production team decided that Bernard, or known as Bunny to his friends and close ones, that his death should be reflected within the show. And so, of course, the inevitable happened in the show. On the 21st of November 1984, Hilda took a phone call. She didn't actually take the phone call at home because the Ogdens couldn't afford to have a telephone installed within their house. So the call was placed to next door at the corner shop, and Alf came from the corner shop in his dressing gown, tapped the door and said, "Hilda, there's a phone call for you." And it was the hospital asking to speak with Mrs Ogden. And yeah, the hospital called to let Hilda know that her husband of over 40 years, Stanley, had passed away. I remember watching this scene recently, actually, and you saw Hilda speaking on the phone, of course, and her reaction was, "He's gone, Alf. My Stan's gone." And it's one of those really poignant scenes that really, really tugs at your heartstrings, because, I didn't grow up watching these characters. I've just watched them retrospectively, if that's the right word. And when you get to know characters, you really start to grow fond of them. And I really felt that character's pain. Yeah, Hilda was naturally absolutely devastated. One half of her really gone within one phone call. All those years of constant togetherness, up and down, rich and poor, sadness and joy, just gone. And so our neighbours and friends could really see that she was struggling, and thankfully they all rallied round. You could really see a good sense of community there, because they really were looking after one of their own, because one of their own had gone. Even the ruthless boss, Mike Baldwin, offered his condolences and said, if there's anything that you need, please just ask. And it's not often that you got to see that side of Mike Baldwin. He was always known for being the ruthless businessman, of firing out orders at people, and yeah, that was nice to see. And then their only son, Trevor, came to see his mum, to see how she was doing. And as with what happened with his uncle, he started asking about money. And again saying, well, it would be cheaper to get him cremated. But Hilda said, no. No. Absolutely not. I want somewhere where I can bury my husband, have a gravestone, and go to visit him as and when I need to. And she stood to that. Because money was no object to her, as long as her Stanley had somewhere peaceful to rest, and somewhere that marked where he was resting. And also she did actually have the money for a plot and a gravestone and things, so that was really good. And so Stanley Ogden was buried on a very cold, either November or December morning. And when you watch the scenes, Hilda doesn't get hysterical or start crying. She's very stoic, very brave, almost as if it's not quite hit her yet. And about a week after she buried her husband, Hilda took delivery of a brown parcel. And that brown parcel turned out to be from the hospital, and it was all neatly tied up with a little bit of string, and it was Stanley's personal effects from the hospital. And in it were things like his pyjamas and slippers and a little case. And as she looked at the pyjamas and things, she looked rather sombre, and you could see that she was getting a little bit more emotional. And then it came to opening up this little case, and within this case was Stan's glasses. So she opens up this box and sees the glasses, and then all of the emotions just came spilling out. Yeah, Hilda, she just completely fell apart when she opened up these glasses and saw it, because I suppose with something as personal as spectacles, that kind of represents what that person is. It's like a really personal thing to them, and so when she saw that, she just completely went to pieces. Now, as Jean Alexander was acting out this scene, there was no dialogue, and even without the dialogue, it was said that Jean Alexander had moved the whole crew just completely to tears with no dialogue, which I think is an amazing achievement. And so, yeah, after that, a couple of weeks, Hilda got fed up with moping, and she had to return to work, of course, for money, really. And so, soon after that, Hilda felt quite, in my opinion, and also it was reflected in the script as well, Hilda started to feel quite lonely, because she'd gone from having Stan and Eddie and, other people popping in and out, to just no one, just to being her in that house on her own. So she decided to take in some lodgers. First came Terry Duckworth. He was the wayward son of Jack and Vera. He moved in with Hilda because he was finding that living with his parents wasn't working out, because his dad Jack wasn't tipping up enough money, and Terry found that he had to keep giving more and more housekeeping to his mum because his dad wasn't giving it, and he felt this to be quite unfair, so he moved in with Hilda for a bit. Yeah, very much to the dismay of Vera, but like I said a wee while ago, two characters who have quite big personalities, they just really clashed. And then came one of the more unusual characters in the form of a man called Henry Wakefield. I think the actor's name that played him, I think he was called Funtime Fontaine, and I think that's a really interesting name. I'm sure it's a stage name, but yeah, isn't that a cool name? Yeah, Henry was like a real lover of books and his railways, and he'd moved to, the Wakefield area because in his previous job, and unbeknown to his new job within the factory, he was actually what's known as a scab. Now, a scab is someone that works through a workers' strike, and when they found this out at the factory at Baldwin's Casuals, he soon had to leave that job and, of course, leave Hilda's lodgings. And so later on in 1985, Hilda soon took in a very fresh-faced Kevin Webster. I'll say fresh-faced, he had the 80s tash. If you don't know what I mean, I'll pop a picture up here. It's interesting. He would have regular visits from his then girlfriend, who was then known as Sally Seddon. I believe now she's called Sally Metcalf, so she married again after Kevin. So yes, she became Kevin's fiancée and then became his wife. Now, Hilda and Sally didn't get on initially because Hilda had held up a reputation of the Seddon family and she was not impressed. So they didn't get on initially, but they soon grew to like each other. And so in 1986, Kevin and Sally got married and they started living above the corner shop, leaving Hilda alone again. And so we forward to 1987, which was Hilda's final year in Coronation Street. Actress Jean Alexander had decided that after playing the role of Hilda for over 20 years that she wanted to leave. And also in real life she wanted to just slow down a little bit, really, to have more time to herself to do the things that she wanted to do, which I don't think that's really selfish of her. It's just allowing her to enjoy life more, I think. Even though it was Jean's own decision to leave, Corrie fans actually started a petition called Save Hilda because they were under the impression that Coronation Street had sacked her, whereas no, they hadn't. It was just Jean Alexander had decided to leave of her own accord because, like I said, she wanted more time to herself. Why not? And so, yeah, after almost selling number 13 to a con artist, thankfully she didn't. Alf Roberts soon put her straight on that one. Hilda settled into like a cosy friendship with Sally's uncle called Tom Hopwood. Tom, he grew really fond of Hilda and he really wanted their relationship to go to the next level and be, like a companionship. Hilda had only really viewed the relationship as, just strictly platonic, and she was completely agog when Tom proposed to her. She said that she couldn't marry him. She was very flattered, but she couldn't marry him because she was still, even though she was a widow, she was still Stanley Ogden's wife. And so, yeah, she turned down the marriage proposal and his plans to move to a bungalow in Formby. And yeah, I mean, after Stan died, the character of Hilda, in my opinion, and I suppose a lot of other people's opinion, she was never quite the same. It was a bit like there was always something missing from her. I can't really put my finger on anything tangible. It was just like a light had went out for Hilda, and I suppose something must have shifted for Jean Alexander when she'd spent a lot of time working with Bernard Ewins. I suppose she missed him a lot. And yeah, between 1984 and 1987, Hilda changed. She was a lot more quiet, a little bit more reserved, I would say. And do you remember how I said that Hilda was working for Dr. Lowther? Well, in the November of 1987, whilst helping Dr. Lowther and Mrs. Lowther pack their things so they could move house, what happened was Dr. Lowther had went out to get a takeaway, and Hilda and Mrs. Lowther were packing up things to, in preparation for the move. And there was a burglary that happened whilst they were in there, and Hilda had a bump to the head, and I think Mrs. Lowther had some sort of injury. Later on, Mrs. Lowther died from her injuries, unfortunately. And yeah, Hilda had the bump to the head, and so she had to go to hospital, of course, to be looked after. And when she was there, she had a visitor, and the visitor was none other than Eddie Yates. Remember him? What had happened in real life, actor Geoffrey Hughes, because he was aware that Jean Alexander was leaving the show, he really wanted a last opportunity of working with Jean, just as, I suppose, a mark of respect, really, just to say thank you for all that you've taught me and for the joy that you brought, working with you, which I think is amazing. You don't really hear of that often these days, if at all, do you? which I suppose is like a testament as to how much Geoffrey Hughes respected not only the character of Hilda, but also Jean as a person and Jean as an actor. I think that's really nice. Don't you? Yeah, and so Eddie and Hilda spoke briefly. Eddie said, "What are you doing here?" and things like that. And he spoke about Marion and the baby that they had, and it was like a nice brief return, which was nice. Kind of. Well, I'll get on to why it was nice in just a second. Now, around this kind of time frame, Hilda was sacked by Mike Baldwin. I can remember why he had sacked her, because Hilda voiced her opinion of his failed marriage to Susan Barlow, which was the daughter of Ken Barlow, which Mike married, in my opinion, out of revenge. But that's a whole different video. If you want me to do it, let me know in the comments, and I will. So yeah, that kind of spurred her on to make the move from Coronation Street even more. Now, by this point, Dr. Lowther had offered Hilda like the chance of a lifetime, really, to move house with him. What he was planning was he would move into a new house, and there was a flat attached to the said house that Hilda could live in, so she could live there and, you know, come back and forth to clean the main house for him. And so when Dr. Lowther kind of recovered a little bit from the shock of the death of his wife, because it was, well, you would be absolutely distraught when your wife dies, wouldn't you? Well, you like to think so, or hope so, but anyway, that's just me. And so, yes, Hilda took up Dr. Lowther's offer and made plans to move away with him. Not in a romantic sense, it was just merely a platonic employee kind of relationship going there. And so Hilda put plans in motion, and what she did was she sold number 13 Coronation Street to Kevin and Sally Webster. She'd sold her and Stan's little palace, and she was ready to move on. So as she packed up her things, she kind of reflected on the highs and the lows and all the memories of her and Stan there. I've not seen that one yet. I think I'd be quite emotional, really, watching that. I know they're fictional characters, but I still really believe in them. Oops, spittle, not attractive, sorry. And so on Hilda's very last day, which was Christmas Day 1987, after she'd, you know, been packing up her belongings and things, she decided she wanted to go along to the pub for, you know, probably a light ale. I think that was Hilda's choice, or a port and lemon. That was, you know, her special occasion drink. But unbeknown to her, every single one of her friends and neighbours was organising a surprise party. And like I said, every one of her friends were there, all of her neighbours were there, and it was a really nice atmosphere, and there was some nice gifts bought for her. One was a clock, and the other one, it was a kind of a nod to what Hilda was always, well, one of the things Hilda was always most famous for, which was her curlers. Now, I thought this was a really touching gift. Someone had actually bought Hilda her very own set of heated rollers, which is so nice, I think. And so it came to our last scene, and everyone was there, and there was someone playing the piano, and Hilda started to sing, and the last thing that she was singing was, wish me luck as you wave me goodbye, here I go, cheerio. Yeah, I'm not great at singing it. And yes, that was the last, for now, that we've seen of Hilda. That episode in 1987 was actually Corrie's highest ever ratings for the viewing figures, and it still is to this date, with 27 million people watching. Let's just take a moment to think about that. 27 million people in 1987, when not everyone had a television set. I think that's amazing. But like I said, that wasn't the last that we saw of Mrs Ogden. In 1990, Jean Alexander came back briefly as part of ITV's telethon. She popped into the Rovers to let everyone know that Dr. Lowther had actually proposed marriage to her. But in that sort of mini episode, you saw Hilda going to visit Stan's grave, and she had a chat with him, and she said that it was a lovely offer, but she would always be Mrs. Stanley Ogden, and she couldn't accept. Yet Mrs. Ogden, always and forever. And that was the last anyone saw of Hilda Ogden. Now, I thought I would do a little bit of trivia about the actor who played Hilda Ogden. Her name was Jean Alexander. Jean was actually born Jean Mavis Hodgkinson, and she actually used Alexander as a stage name. I wasn't aware of that until fairly recently, and normally I'm quite up to date with things like stage names and real names. She never married, never had any children, and always saw acting as her first love, and kind of preferred the company of her cats. Now, in real life, Jean Alexander sounded nothing like Hilda Ogden. When people met her in real life, they were always saying to her, "Why have you got that funny posh voice?" Because her voice was a lot lower than Hilda's, and it was a lot more of a posher accent, really. And so people were really amazed. She rarely gave journalistic or televised interviews because she wasn't enacting for the fame. She was just enacting for the beauty of it, for the art of it. She wasn't in it for the fame. And on the rare occasions that she did give, televised interviews, from what I've seen, she was quite shy, reserved, introverted, and not really familiar with all the showbiz side of things, which is, I find, interesting. Jean was always interested in her garden and supporting animal charities, which is always nice to hear. It was said that Jean wanted to leave Coronation Street because she wanted to retire, but she didn't do that. After leaving Coronation Street, she had roles in Last of the Summer Wine, where she played Auntie Wainwright. You remember her? She was the antique dealer that was always trying to sell you something, or bric-a-brac or whatever. And she had a starring guest role in ITV comedy Barbara, and she played Gwen Taylor's mother-in-law. Her famous fans actually included Lord Laurence Olivier, Sir Michael Parkinson and Russell Harty. On the 11th of October 2016, Jean Alexander passed away, aged 90, just 3 days after her birthday. This was following a short illness. And the legacy that she left us in the form of Hilda Ogden is still current and present to this day. And that's one of the main reasons why I'm doing these videos, to keep all of these actors' hard work, just to keep it present. So, I really hope that you've enjoyed watching this part 2 as much as I've had creating it. If you would like to thank me in some way, if you've not already done so, hit that subscribe button. You can do it down there, and I'll leave a little sticker at the end of this video. And, leave the thumbs up. Comment below about your favourite Hilda Ogden moments, and share with your friends, and yeah, all that good stuff. Also, let me know any requests you have for future Cobble Icons episodes. Yeah? Cool. I'll see you again soon. Ta-ra, choke.